I am Mary McNaughton. I'm director of the Ruth Chandler Williamson Gallery, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium, which we have organized in conjunction with the extraordinary exhibition that's currently on view at the Pasadena Museum of California Art. It's called Picturing Mexico, Alfredo Ramos Martínez in California. And this is the first comprehensive look at the work that Ramos Martínez made between 1929 and 46. And so it's a rare opportunity to see an extraordinary array of his paintings and works on paper. And it will be up until April 20th. So be sure to see it before it closes. We're pleased to lend works from the Scripps collection, and we are so interested because this exhibition offers new insights into the work of this important painter who was a pioneer of the Mexican mural movement and who created his culminating work, the 100-foot fresco mural, The Flower Vendors, here at Scripps College. At the end of the program, as I said, we'll have a tea in the garden, so you will know a lot about the mural by the time you see it in the garden, and you'll be able to enjoy it firsthand. So I'd like to welcome some special guests today. Jenkins Shannon, who's director of the Pasadena Museum of California Art, who's here with her husband Bob. And guest curator of the exhibition, Amy Galpin, who's now curator of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum at Rollins College, and she's also one of today's speakers. Other speakers are Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Mary Goodwin, one of our panelists, and paintings conservator Annetta Zabala, who has her firm in Santa Monica. And finally, Suzanne Muchnick, who many of you know, art writer, and you may not know, she is a trustee of Scripps College. She will moderate our panel discussion. We're also extremely happy to have with us the daughter of Alfredo Ramos Martínez, Maria Bolster, and her husband Charles, who are here today. Maria is such a valuable resource for all those who study Ramos Martínez's art, and we thank her for the assistance she's given us to the archives at Scripps. For help strengthening the holdings of Ramos Martínez at Scripps, we are deeply grateful to Louis Stern, who is owner of Louis Stern Gallery, and who has donated to Scripps several significant works, including charcoal and tempera painting El Nacimiento of 1935, tempera painting Christus of 1943, and a tempera and pastel work, Coconut Vendor, of 1938. He's been very keen to have the Scripps collection have representative works of different periods and different artistic processes that Martínez practiced. So we are very grateful to him, and we also want you to know that he has produced a wonderful book, Alfredo Ramos Martínez and Modernismo, which presents an in-depth look at a rich array of his work, paintings, prints, and murals. And we hope that you'll be able to see this book. After the symposium, we may have some of them in the Margaret Fowler Garden for you to look at and purchase if you'd like. We also welcome the docents of the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, who earlier visited this year to see murals at Pomona and Scripps. And for arranging today's event, I thank the superb members of the Williamson Gallery staff, including Jennifer Anderson, Colleen Salomon, Kirk Delman, and T. Robert. They anticipated and attended to every detail of this event, and I'm very grateful to them. We also appreciate the assistance of the Director of Grounds, Lola Traficante, for opening the garden for us, and Director of Dining, Tom Adkins, for the tea. For supporting the event, we are most grateful to our Dean of Faculty, Amy Marcus Newhall, and the Clark Fund. Well, this symposium revisits the art of Alfredo Ramos Martínez, known by many as the father of Mexican mural painting, who paved the way for Los Tres Grandes, Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. In fact, Siqueiros was a student of Ramos Martínez. Claremont, as you know, is rich in murals. In 1932, Orozco painted the Prometheus mural at Freire Dining Hall at Pomona College. And in 1946, Ramos Martínez painted the flower vendors in the Margaret Fowler Garden. This was his last major work that he was working on, although there were other projects in progress at the same time. His plate was very full. Unfortunately, on November 8th, 1946, he fell ill and died soon after. Although the mural is unfinished, its panels, which are all in different states of completion, leave fascinating evidence of his practice and process. And these visible traces were very interesting to the conservators who treated it, and Annetta Zabala will give us some insight into how he worked. In 1995-96, supported by an NEA grant and private contributors, we undertook conservation of the mural, which included redesigning the roof over the murals, moving an air conditioning unit away from the wall, changing the whole water drainage system around the wall, and then 10 years later, we returned to the mural to give it a follow-up cleaning. We're grateful for the excellent work done on conservation by 3 talented conservators in Los Angeles, Jerry Padani, Eduardo Sanchez, who are from the Department of Antiquities Conservation at the Getty Villa, and Annetta Zabala, who's our panelist today and speaker. Well, today's schedule is this. As your program shows, there will be 3 talks, followed by a panel discussion. After the first 2 talks, there will be a brief 10-minute break, followed by the 3rd talk and then the panel. And at the conclusion, then we'll walk next door to the garden for tea. So as your program contains the biographical summaries for each speaker, I'll just give very brief introductions to each. Our first speaker is Amy Galpin, who received her PhD at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And she, as I mentioned, is guest curator of Picturing Mexico. I first met Amy when, as curator of the Art of the Americas at the San Diego Museum of Art, she came to Scripps to look at the Ramos Martínez works in our collection. And she's had a special interest in Mexican mural painting for some time. For example, the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago, she organized the exhibition Translating Revolution, U.S. Artists Interpret Mexican Muralism. And then in San Diego, she organized several exhibitions, including Women, War, and Industry, and Behold America, Art of the United States, from 3 San Diego museums. She was recently appointed curator of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum at Rollins College, and today she'll focus on an aspect of Ramos Martínez's art that has received less attention, his religious imagery. In a talk entitled Making Religion Modern, Alfredo Ramos Martínez and his contemporaries. Please join me in welcoming Amy Galpin.
Thank you, Mary, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here today. It's really such an honor to be here at Scripps. As Mary said, I have been coming to Scripps to look at Ramos Martínez mural for some time now, and it's rare to have such a treat to speak about an artist in proximity to one of his great masterpieces. One of the things that is interesting to me, of course, in the history of art is that how we often kind of pigeonhole artists and classify them as one type of artist or another. Ramos Martínez, because of his great murals here in Southern California, is often classified as a muralist. He's often his work is described as decorative, and that kind of term might stem from the mural commission I'm showing you right here from La Avenida Café, which was on Orange Avenue in Coronado. And I apologize for the fuzzy image on the right. That's my only image in color of La Avenida Café. It's now Bistro de Asia, the Bistro of Asia. It no longer exists. The image on the left is also a vintage photograph of the interior of La Avenida Café. The images on the bottom are where these pieces of these murals now exist. The maroon background background is in a private collection here in Los Angeles, a private home, and the work on the right is in the Coronado Public Library. Certainly, these types of commissions and the repetition of pattern and form might lend to this description of decorative. But I aim to show, I hope, in the exhibition at the Pasadena Museum of California Art, and also in my talk today, that Ramos Martínez occupies an in-between space. He's not a decorative artist, he's not a political artist, he's multidimensional, and to just categorize him as one or another is limiting. On the left, I have an article from the San Diego Tribune, Union Tribune, announcing Ramos Martínez Ensenada murals at the Hotel Riviera and Casino, along with an image of a picture that's in the show, if you've seen it, from another private collection here in Southern California. And on the right, Defensor, the protector, one of Ramos Martínez's more political images, in that we have, our figure here with the fist raised, created in 1932, the same time that Siqueiros is here in Los Angeles. Ramos Martínez is both these things. He's a portrait artist who made many wonderful images of beautiful ladies, like we see May Healy on the left, and also an artist who created countless socially relevant images, as we see with the Protector. Although modernity and religious art are often thought of as conflicting notions, there are a number of modern artists who engaged with religious themes and subject matter. In France, artists such as Pierre Matisse, Maurice Denis, and Georges Rouault produced religious compositions through a lens of modernism. In Mexico, Federico Cantú, Chucho Reyes, and Maria Izquierdo also experimented with religious motifs while producing modern art. Alfredo Ramos Martínez, among others, developed work that was dominated by figural forms and reinforced human experience through narratives that told stories of daily life, struggle, and redemption. This approach aligned with an interest in religious art, and specifically for Ramos Martínez, Roman Catholic faith. Indeed, Ramos Martínez was a multidimensional artist, and after moving to California, he frequently oscillated between representations related to Mexican identity and religion. There were a few important examples of noted American painters who dealt with religious subject matter during the first half of the 20th century. American artist John Lafarge created a number of religiously motivated murals during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including his first mural, which was realized for the Trinity Church in Boston in 1873. Another Lafarge mural, American Madonna, from 1904 for the Emmanuel Chapel of St. Luke's Cathedral in Portland, Maine, was inspired by Raphael's Sistine Madonna. During his career, Lafarge produced not only murals, but he also completed stained glass windows for churches in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. John Singer Sargent created a large religious mural cycle, the development of religious thought from paganism to Christianity in the United States, though ironically the murals were not made for a church space, but for the Boston Public Library. Sargent's mural consisted of oil-on-canvas panels that were painted in England and then shipped to the United States. The noted French liturgical muralist Puvis de Chavannes painted decorations along the staircase, but after much debate regarding whether or not artists who created work for the project should be American painters, specifically Sargent and Edwin Abbey, were chosen to create the larger mural cycles for the space. Sargent added plaster reliefs to the composition, making the mural a three-dimensional experience. These issues of what is American and American identity, I think, reverberate further in my presentation on Ramos Martínez. While Lafarge and Sargent produced work for audiences in New England, in the early 20th century, across the United States and California, Christianity was represented in a different context. Decades later, references to colonial heritage of California were made in many public art projects of the 30s and 40s, although the subject tended to be romanticized. Here is Balin's 1938 mural created in La Jolla, California for a bank that is now installed at a recreation center in the town. Direct reference to Catholicism was typically made in the depiction of Franciscans, who built a majority of the missions in the area, conducting outreach to the local indigenous populations. So you can see that Hugo Balin's representation of the Franciscans is quite traditional in the way in which it's realized. And here, later, we have Anton Refrigier's murals in the Rincon Annex, which were created for a post office in San Francisco, are much more monumental in form and have less ornate detail and are more sort of abstract, more reminiscent of the Mexican muralists than the work of Hugo Balin. Ramos Martínez also depicted local missionaries, and here we have his depiction of Junipero Serra. And this work is not in the exhibition. There's a different representation of Junipero Serra. This is a small-scale work. I love the angular lines of the friar's cloak, the legs of the Christ figure, that angular shapes that are so often found in Ramos Martínez's work. Commissioned to create a mural cycle for the chapel at the cemetery in Santa Barbara in 1934, Ramos Martínez used the opportunity to meld his distinctive style, his passion for murals, and a deep connection to his faith. The location of the small chapel is breathtaking, as the cemetery where it is located possesses sweeping views of the Pacific Ocean and nearby mountains. Ramos Martínez's wife later wrote this poetic description of the murals in the chapel. The frescoes are among his most notable works, every atom of his artistic faith, knowledge, and strength he incorporated into the composition, which is at once an expression of the love of his art and his love of God. Here, Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez recognizes that this commission results in the melding of the painter's interests in art and religion. Without a doubt, upon entering the small, simple chapel located a few miles from the center of Santa Barbara, the immediate power of the mural cycle is revealed. This commission for Santa Barbara was the idea of Mary Smith and Henry Icahn. Smith was the widow of the architect George Washington Smith, who designed the chapel. Icahn was a talented violinist and composer. Both established a strong friendship with the artist, and they would remain his patrons. Here, in this image from a Santa Barbara newspaper, published on Sunday morning, December 1st, 1940, Mary Smith kneels before a Ramos Martínez depiction of the Virgin Mary. The caption reads, "Flower arrangements by Wendell Richard Gilbert, built around a Martínez Madonna, flanked by swags of brown leaves and seed pods, pine cones and palm branches fill the fireplace, while Mrs. George Washington Smith in the foreground." Mrs. Smith also ran a gallery, the Renaissance Gallery on Mesa Road in Montecito, that exhibited the artist's work. Given the artist's close relationship with the architect's widow, the way in which Ramos Martínez's Santa Barbara mural cycle works seamlessly with the architecture of the chapel is not surprising. The delicate symmetry between the architectural design of the space and the painted areas that cover and activate both small corners and crevices and dominate large walls demonstrate the artist's sensitivity to architecture. Again, Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez proceeds with her poignant description of the Santa Barbara cycle, grief-stricken humanity. A large group of heads bent by the weight of sorrow and covering their faces with their hands symbolizes mortal suffering and misery. Before them, the Christ of peace, like a spiritual consolation, extends his hands to those who weep for the loved ones that they have lost. This is the most theatrical moment revealed in the mural cycle, as it juxtaposes a group of people, representing parishioners, sinners, and the unfettered masses, who place their hands before their faces and hang their heads low, expressing through gesture the agony they experience. Indeed, Ramos Martínez depicts this group of people as humble and obedient before the eyes of God. The drama described above is mitigated by the muted color palette chosen by the artist. So you see, when you walk into the chapel, you see this image, and then if you walk to the back and stand at the altar, and you look out down the nave, you see this. Maria Sodi Ramos Martínez continues her powerful description of the murals for the Santa Barbara Cemetery. A procession of monks, nuns, and women of all nations are moving in the direction of God, the resurrection, and the life. White lilies comprise the offerings that they are carrying, and the same flowers adorn the arches of the dome and are held in the hands of the angels. The angular forms used to represent the nuns and the friars give the mural cycle a modern sensibility. I have another image. In portraying the religious, ornate detail is spared, with the exception of the white lilies that form a considerable horizontal line across the composition. Around the time that Ramos Martínez completed this mural, he created a number of small-scale works that also represented the clergy and served as studies for his larger mural project. With friars and nuns from about 1934, the artist represents 4 nuns facing 3 monks. One of the nuns kneeling on the ground in prayer. Prayer was a part of Ramos Martínez's daily life, and he once stated, "Every night I go down on my knees to thank the dear God that has made me to do nothing all my long life but paint." Behind the religious figures, the loosely defined architectural space that arches and the dark blue ominous sky in the background exude a surrealist sensibility. This piece was exhibited as a part of the California Pacific International Exposition in Balboa Park in San Diego in 1935. Ramos Martínez's use of newsprint provided an economical way in which to create work. The pages of the newspaper were readily available and easy to discard, so simply put, the artist had easy access to the surface. However, the text printed on the surface often provided an interesting juxtaposition for the artist's work. So that's to say, it cannot just be purely by coincidence to use the newspaper. While the artist often used the Los Angeles Times to depict his fruit and flower vendors and manual laborers, he also turned to papers such as the Hollywood Citizen News, the San Francisco Chronicle, New York Times, and El Universal. The sense of architecture in this particular representation of a nun, her garb is amplified by the newspaper itself. The long vertical lines recall Art Deco architecture. The folds of the top of the headpiece give the work dimensionality. 3 years after he completed the Santa Barbara mural cycle, Ramos Martínez was offered another opportunity for a spiritually focused project. A second fresco mural portraying a religious theme was realized for the Church of Mary, Star of the Sea in La Jolla in 1937, the same year he began the mural for the Avenida Cafe. Completed on the facade of the church above the front door, the mural was straightforward, without excessive details. The architect of the church was Carlton Monroe Winslow, who first came to San Diego in 1915 to participate in the Panama, California exposition. The commission at Mary Star of the Sea was prompted by Dr. Jesse Albert Locke and supervised by Father McNamara, the head priest of the church from 1935 to 1939. Here is a Madonna by Ramos Martínez dedicated to Father McNamara. The church was the second Catholic space built on the site. The first church was built in 1904 when there were approximately 150 Catholic families living in La Jolla. The dedication of the new church was on December 5th, 1937. Few historic photographs exist of the Ramos Martínez work. This mural did not last because its condition quickly deteriorated due partially to its proximity to the ocean and the salt air. A portion of the work fell from the facade of the church. The mural depicted Mary with a star behind her and ocean water at her feet, with two angels on either side. Arthur Millier, the longtime critic of the Los Angeles Times, when writing about the memorial exhibition of Ramos Martínez's work at the Hatfield Galleries, cited this particular mural as his loveliest. The palette of the mural possessed the soft brown hues, a color choice originated in Ramos Martínez's amber-tinged landscapes in Europe, in contrast to the restrained color palette that dominates the composition. The blue of the ocean adds a sense of vibrancy to the mural. Today, what you're looking at is a mosaic mural, which has replaced the original Ramos Martínez work. Though realized in a different medium, the church commissioned an artist to create a work that retained the composition of Ramos Martínez's original mural and covered the portions of the damaged fresco that remained on the facade. Millier, again, the critic for the LA Times, would describe Ramos Martínez's mural production as his most enduring monuments. He continued, in their purity of spirit and design and color, they recall Fra Angelico's works. While I aim to highlight a distinctive aspect to Ramos Martínez's work in presenting his religious work, this part of his oeuvre should not be separated from his others. Here, this small representation of a mother looking at her child with care parallels his myriad representations of Mary with baby Jesus. Moreover, the bound figure here, created during World War II, parallels the representation of Christ in the collection of the Ruth Chandler Williamson Gallery at Scripps that Mary mentioned in her introduction. These figures, oppressed by the ropes that bind them, are united by their suffering. So, I think there is a connection between Ramos Martínez's interest in portraying the indigenous population, whether it's mother and child, whether it's suffering, this work, The Bound Figure, done during World War II, in pairing these works with the religious works, we see a shared sense of social consciousness, a shared recognition of suffering. To further understand Alfredo Ramos Martínez's religious work, I would like to provide some context for this type of artistic production among his contemporaries. Ramos Martínez and Jean Charlot share some interesting biographical facts. Both artists spent time in France, in particular in Brittany. Both were on the periphery of the Mexican modern movement and lived in Mexico at the dawn of Mexican muralism. Both became more religious-focused in their artistic production in the United States. Here are some early works created by the French-born Charlot. As a teenager, he was a member of a religious society and admired the work of Maurice Denis. The print, Head of Christ, was one of his earliest works. This other print, a print from his first Stations of the Cross, he would create many versions of the Stations of the Cross during his life. Charlot and Alfredo Ramos Martínez share an affinity for narrative art. The story revealed by the Stations is one of the most dramatic and compelling in Christian history. Charlot and his mother emigrated from France to Mexico by 1921. After spending 8 years in Mexico, he moved to the United States. Although he would return to Mexico and the impact of the indigenous populations of Mexico would stay with him forever, he made a career for himself in the United States as a professor and a religious artist. Here is a painting from '57, a depiction of Joseph the Carpenter in tondo form, the circular form, in reference to religious works created during the Renaissance. Charlot often depicted Joseph and found artistic inspiration in his religious significance, but also in his profession as a laborer and specifically a carpenter. In addition to countless small-scale religious works, Charlot produced murals in disparate places such as North Carolina, Michigan, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Arizona, and Hawaii, among other places. Also, like Ramos Martínez, but perhaps in a different way, but those angled forms that are so distinctive of Charlot's work, we see in this work, and also in this study for a fresco created in Kansas, at an abbey in Atchison, Kansas. Indeed, Ramos Martínez and a select group of contemporaries, such as Jean Charlot, make up an important part of the story of modern religious art in the United States. In describing Charlot's artistic process in developing liturgical art, Frank Sheed, a Catholic publisher, wrote, "When he was reading scripture, he saw it as a scene he was painting, saw it in itself, saw it in its context, but his mind was doing its own kind of seeing too." Here, Sheed identifies the process of reading and the method of constructing images as one and the same for Charlot. The practice of religion and the making of art were innately connected for Charlot, as was making liturgical art of significance. Charlot could be harsh when describing liturgical art that he found to be objectionable. He wrote, "We pray before plaster-cast saints as soft-textured as margarine and colored as sickeningly as that mammoth ice cream sundae once known as Moron's Delight." Here is an image of a fresco Charlot produced in Kauai. He produced 3 different public religious projects on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. He wanted with these projects to fill a void of liturgical art. The artist was not shy in his estimation of bad liturgical art, though his son John Charlot put his reasoning behind these strong sentiments more eloquently when he wrote, "All his life, Charlot would fight for some recognition of the importance of good art for Christianity, as opposed to the more patronized bad art that he found diabolical in the strictest sense of the term. It distanced people from God." Religious art produced without concern for quality prevented people from practicing their faith, from Charlot's perspective. His perspective and his faith and his expression of liturgical art were not immune to current events. He developed liturgical art as a response to events that he could not explain. For example, Charlot's Old Testament subjects tended to be fearsome: the fall, the flood, the sacrifice of Isaac, and he used them to articulate tragic feelings about life, especially World War I and World War II. The dramatic events described in the Bible, from environmental disaster to tragic death, affected Charlot, and he was able to see relationships with these religious narratives and the current events he witnessed. Charlot's interest in communities and cultures that were traditionally neglected by mainstream society could be understood in terms of his religious faith. He wrote, "Perhaps I have stressed the role of the eye unduly. There is still a deeper contact with the church, wherein all geographical and racial dissimilarities become reconciled, a common denominator or nucleus that binds together laymen and clerics all around the world." Like Charlot, like Ramos Martínez, Charlot occupies an in-between space. Charlot aspired to have people from all different cultural backgrounds and economic experiences be involved with art, and specifically to engage with his work. Art historian Carolyn Clark commented on this subject. His work in the United States continued to express a particular interpretation of Catholicism that stressed the universal definition of the word, and increasingly focused on the creation of liturgical arts. It was not until his arrival in the Pacific Islands, however, that his art began to synthesize his ideas with those of local cultures, infusing his art with the same passion observable in his Mexican portfolio. For Clark, the true transformation for Charlot happens after the artist settles in Hawaii. This particular work was created, as you can see from the slide, in Fiji. It was the same parish priest who had brought him to Kauai, who later moved on to Fiji, that commissioned this particular work. And you can see the artist's models are many of the people that he met in Fiji. Likewise, in the US, there were artists who represented Christian imagery. Some worked in disparate parts of the United States, like Boston or Chicago, and others, like Ramos Martínez, made California their homes. So I have two works here from the museum where I am currently employed, and we see George Noyes, a much more conservative religious image. George Noyes was a landscape painter. He also did go to Mexico and spent time, several months in Cuernavaca before settling in Boston. This particular religious image was inspired by time that he spent in Tuscany. On the right, many of you are probably familiar with Ivan Albright. His imagery is kind of often recognized for its sort of rumpled skin and rumpled forms. And you see in the cloak of the man, the hands and his face, sort of the signature style of Ivan Albright. Closer to home, here in California, two artists that occasionally reference religious subject matter. Edith Caitlin Phelps studied with Charles Hawthorne, William Merritt Chase in New York. She studied at the Académie Julian in Paris, but she settled in Santa Barbara and was acknowledged with a number of local prizes, both in San Diego and in Santa Barbara, for her work. Here we have her Wayside Madonna. On the left, much more well-known, Charles White, who had his artistic awakening in the city of Chicago, later moving here to Los Angeles, a longtime professor at Otis. He was very much inspired by the Mexican muralists, and we see in this monumental form recalling, for example, the figures of Siqueiros. In the early years in which he settled in the United States, I had a couple more before I finish. Sorry, I forgot about Alan Rohan Crete, another artist, another religious artist, was very involved with the Episcopal Church on the East Coast and very interested in portraying the people of his neighborhood in Boston in religious works, experimenting with new materials, both old and new, making this woodcut with gold leaf, referring to historical traditions, but obviously inform a much more modern representation. In the early years in which he settled in the United States, Ramos Martínez found himself living in a complex time in the nation's history. With the stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing economic depression of the 1930s, the country that Ramos Martínez moved to was experiencing turmoil. Despite the tough financial times, he was able to find economic opportunity in the United States and to develop distinctive religiously motivated bodies of work. The way in which Ramos Martínez viewed the world was informed by his religious beliefs. Everett G. Jackson, an artist who spent a considerable amount of time in Mexico and possessed deep respect for both Charlot and Ramos Martínez, wrote of the latter, Martínez took no part in the social and political controversies which raged among most of the modern artists of Mexico. He was not concerned with this or that ideology. And I believe it would be true to say that all the revolutionary artists of his time felt that his influence would prove in the end as great a force towards social and economic justice as their own. Ramos Martínez was really a Saint Francis of our time. Jackson recognized that even though Ramos Martínez did not create work as overtly radical as some of his contemporaries, he was just as concerned with social and economic issues and held a steadfast concern for the plight of the people. Ramos Martínez's work makes up an important part of the legacy of modern religious art in California. Christian art in California is a part of the visual culture in different manifestations. Mission life was represented in many WPA-era murals in California, and some contemporary muralists have embraced the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe in their work. Ramos Martínez produced religious murals for the cemetery chapel in Santa Barbara and for the church facade of Mary Star of the Sea. His representation of native cultures aligned with his oppressed populations and his with oppressed populations, and his religious work connected him to his own faith and testified to his attempt to create art that was simultaneously modern and religious. This notion might seem contradictory in some cultural contexts, but in Los Angeles it makes sense. Many stories are told in Los Angeles. With the backdrop of economic depression, repatriation, and World War II, Ramos Martínez told his own story of Mexico's past and present. From 1929 to 1946, through the lens of California and his thoughtful use of newsprint, fresco, and canvases, the artist contributed his own narrative to the larger history of modernism. The artist's religious subjects were often inspired by his own devout beliefs. He once painted a Madonna after returning from midnight mass on Christmas, as he was unable to sleep. Nuns, Juniperosera, Madonna and Child, and the Holy Family were among his frequent subjects. By studying his religious works, we can understand his total artistic production in new ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for a fascinating talk that really shed new light on Ramos Martínez for me and put him into such a rich context. All right, our next speaker is Mary Goodwin, who is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But she grew up in Southern California, so she has connections here in the Southland. She received her BA at UC Santa Cruz and then went to Boston University for both her MA and PhD. She has also taught courses in the history of visual culture at California State University at San Bernardino. And Mary has been interested in the art of Ramos Martínez for many years. And she has developed a real specialty in another aspect of his art that deserves more attention, and that is his printmaking. So today she'll be shedding light on that in a talk entitled Printmaking in Los Angeles and the Role of Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez. So please join me in welcoming Mary Goodwin.
Thank you, Mary. It's great to be here. I'm Mary Goodwin, and I'd like to thank Mary McNaughton for organizing this tribute to Alfredo Ramos Martínez here at this beautiful site. Thank you to Amy Galpin and the staff of the Pasadena Museum of California Art. Thank you to Louis Stern and to Maria Martinez Bolster. Indian Girl with Floripondios is an image that has hung in my parents' house for as long as I can remember. It is a 30-inch high image of a stately and stylized Latin American woman supporting vegetation in her cupped hand. Surrounded by a wooden frame without glass, I always presumed it was an original painting by Alfredo Ramos Martínez, a friend of my family who died before my birth. I could see texture, tiny brush strokes, and no sign of the telltale dots that would indicate duplication through the photographic half-tone screen process. The fact that both my grandmother and my aunt had the same painting hanging over their couches perplexed me somewhat. At the same time, I did not need to read the theorist Walter Benjamin to be aware of the duplicity of images in the 20th century. Benjamin's 1936 article, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, only filled me in on what was already evident to a child growing up in the shadow of the Hollywood sign. Replications are pervasive. Originality is elusive. This image beckons me to undertake my own analysis of its meaning in the hybrid culture that is Los Angeles. In order to research this work, I have had to target the Depression years of the early 1930s, when Alfredo Ramos Martínez painted the work, as well as the post-World War II period of 1948, when this image was reproduced 200 times as a silkscreen print by the artist widow, Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez. She used an extraordinary 62 different colors over 62 different hand-painted screens in order to replicate nuances found in the original oil painting. As an art historian now, I know it's extremely rare to have a print of 62 screens. Walter Benjamin notwithstanding, I'm not ashamed to admit that I was fooled into believing that it was a painting. I have discovered that museums and publishers have been fooled in another way. Most fail to identify the screen printer. In collection after collection, Martínez images have been labeled as silk screens, but by Alfredo Ramos Martínez himself. The dates have been incorrectly noted as the 1940s during the artist's lifetime, rather than the actual dates after his death. So we've landed at a question that recurs in the post-World War II art world. What is an original and what is a replication? Have these multiple images, the products of a widow's grief, in the words of Walter Benjamin, lost their aura? The details of their origin and their deeper significance have been historically detached from the objects. Take, for instance, this silkscreen print produced by Maria Martínez in 1950. The image lingers in cyberspace, available today on the internet, the record of a Bonhams auction event that has long since passed. It's my intention to examine the role of Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez and the 7 editions of prints she created by screen printing in the family's garage in Hollywood between 1947 and 1951. We'll come back to each of these images shortly as I try to reinstate her role in the history of printmaking in California. When Maria de Sode Romero of Oaxaca married Alfredo Ramos Martínez in 1928, her husband was a revered figure in Mexican art. For 2 decades, he had transplanted the styles and ideas of European modernist art into Mexican art. He directed the tumultuous decade of political coups and uprisings following the 30-year dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. At their wedding, Alfredo was 56 and Maria was 40, a vibrant woman who played music, wrote elegantly, and sewed her own stylish clothes. The daughter of a prosperous landowner, she was the 16th of 20 children. When their daughter was born, suffering from a bone disease, Martínez resigned the directorship of the Art Academy, and the family moved to the United States in search of medical attention in 1929. When they moved to California, the United States was entering the throes of the Great Depression. Los Angeles was a city of over 2 million people emerging from its rural status. The most important industries were agriculture, oil, and the movies. Martínez found himself patronized by the wealthy of Los Angeles. People involved in oil and the movies commissioned murals for their homes and bought Martínez paintings, including Edith Head, Hollywood costume designer, shown here. Martínez's California paintings focused largely on indigenism, the celebration of indigenous Mexican culture. He depicted people at work performing traditional native crafts, including painting on the left or weaving on the right, or simply standing in the lushness of the landscape with icons of Mexican identity, such as the woman with floripondios holding the rosette of a maguey succulent in hand in the center. Martínez paintings of the 1930s were often devoid of explicit political content, as we heard from Amy. His paintings on newsprint, however, present consistent irony with their radical juxtapositions of words and images. Here in the detail on the right, I've enlarged the view of the altar linens so you can read the exposed typeface of classified ads visible at the level of the altar linens here. And if you can read them, you can see that they reveal columns of houses for sale. The price of Hollywood housing stands in stark contrast to the poverty of shoeless peasants. Hard to believe, reads one ad. $3,000 down, and beautiful, read others. The leakage between text and image creates a provocative subtext of economic complexity, border labor, neo-colonialization, and the wealth of Catholicism. Another subtext is the Virgin of Guadalupe in her identity as patron saint of the Mexican Revolution, a revolution that originated when peasants aspired to greater economic opportunity. Ramos Martínez dies in 1946, leaving incomplete projects at St. John the Evangelist Church and here at Scripps College. Shortly after his death, Maria Martínez launched into a project to keep her husband's memory alive. She was 58 years old with a 17-year-old daughter to support. In 1949, Mrs. Martínez narrated a life of her husband and prepared a small book. It was distributed in conjunction with a memorial show of his work held in the Dalzell Hatfield Galleries at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in 1951. Available for sale were silkscreen prints, as explained in the catalog. La India de los Floripondios, the serograph print reproduced on the cover in full color, was done by Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez, wife of the artist, from the original oil painting by Alfredo Ramos Martínez in the collection of Miss Corinne Griffith. The serograph edition is limited to 200 prints, size 30 by 24 inches. Price each, $35. Prints may be had by contacting the Martínez Foundation. As a therapeutic process for her grief and as a means of raising needed funds, Maria Martínez modeled her prints on her husband's paintings. Silkscreen technique calls for a porous length of silk stretched upon the bars of a frame. Mrs. Martínez would position her husband's original work under the silk and trace an area of color onto the screen. She would then paint the silk-based image with wax and cover the remainder of the screen with a hand-painted resist of glue. Next, she would dissolve the wax image, leaving the screen clear in its place against the hand-painted resist of glue. Then she would take up a squeegee and spread the ink across the screen so that the ink penetrated onto the paper beneath, becoming a screen-printed image. She used a different screen for every transparent degree of color used. Most likely, one screen of silk was cleaned and reused as a new stencil after each color was applied. Maria Martínez learned silkscreen technique from Guy McCoy when he moved to Los Angeles in 1947. Silkscreen printing was used primarily in commercial printing until McCoy first adopted its use for the creation of artists' multiple originals back in the 1930s. In fact, the word serigraphy was coined then in order to distinguish the work of artists from commercial screen jobs. Remember that in screen printing, only flat colors can be applied. There's no possibility of printing gradations of color on a single print, as one might do a graded wash with watercolor and brush. This accounts for the need for many corrective impressions, each with a transparent tint of a different value. That's certainly true with Maria Martínez's nuanced gradations of honey brown skin and chiaroscuroed flower forms. 200 perfectly registered prints at 62 screens per image meant that in the family garage in Hollywood, Mrs. Martínez went through the process of screening and hanging pages at least 12,000 times. The last page of the exhibition brochure gave thanks to Miss Corinne Griffith for the loan of her painting for reproduction as the first serograph of a work by Alfredo Ramos Martínez. But was it the first serograph of a work by Alfredo Ramos Martínez? I think not. I think that unbeknownst to Mrs. Martínez, other serographs were printed at just about the same time. Here at Scripps College, between 1946 and 1949, Sam Malouf acted as studio assistant to art department chair Millard Sheets. Maloof came with a background in commercial graphics production skills and was hired in part to print silkscreens. In an interview with Mary McNaughton in 2002, Sam Maloof acknowledged that his responsibilities included printing silkscreens of Millard Sheet's original watercolors. Quote, developing screens of 20 or 30 colors, a different screen for each color. Then Millard would come in to do the final screen to tie it all in together, end quote. By 1946, such forward-leaning artists recognized the ambiguities involved in talking of originals and copies. Here is a selection of Millard Sheet's limited edition serigraphs from the 1940s. Marketers consider each serigraphic print to be an original, just as they considered each photograph printed from a negative an original print. Millard Sheets shepherded Martínez into the Scripps world to create the extraordinary Flower Vendor's mural in 1946. There is some evidence to suggest that at some point around this time, Sam Maloof printed at least 2 serigraphic editions based on Martínez's originals. 2 serigraphs thought to be printed by Maloof are in the Scripps collection and Pasadena show, Fruit Vendors with Baskets and Portrait of a Man. Production involved photographing the original Martínez works in order to replicate the printed sections of the San Francisco Chronicle and LA Times utilized as underlayers for the original paintings. Then, hand-rendered color separations were created by Maloof for the remainder of the images. The waxy marks have been made with a looser hand than Maria Martínez. The Ramos Martínez signature in each is screened from the silk, here and here, with no other penciled signature. This stands in contrast to the serigraphs done by Mrs. Martínez, who always signed her serigraphs in pencil, M.S. de Ramos Martínez. You can see the enlarged detail of her signature at the lower left, in addition to her replication of the Ramos Martínez signature in the silkscreen at the upper right. This serigraph, which hangs in the Pasadena exhibition, is on loan from the San Diego Museum of Art. Mrs. Martínez's multicolor serigraph of Flowers in a Mexican Jar of 1950 used another tempera on newsprint painting of her husband's as source. Mrs. Martínez commemorated one of her husband's favorite subjects when she screened Flower Vendors as her next limited edition serigraph based on one of her husband's original paintings. You can see in the detail on the lower left her penciled signature, M.S. de Ramos Martínez, and the traced signature of Ramos Martínez emulated in the silk of the screen and printed on the lower right. In 1951, Mrs. Martínez chose as her last serigraphic edition, Los Amigos. Her husband's original tempera on newsprint painting had already been replicated in black and white photolithography on the cover of the Los Angeles Times Sunday magazine of August 1932. Martínez had used the Times classified ads of earlier that year as the bases for tempera painting. We see Mrs. Martínez's penciled signature on the lower left. In the detail here, you can see it better than the previous images. This enlarged detail also allows us some of the complex viewing pleasure of closely reading the classified ads. Best value by LA, seclusion and view, 30-mile view, out of fog and smog. This brings me to the second part of my investigation. Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez was important to Los Angeles printmaking, not just because of her active participation in her husband's work, but because she served as a teacher and conduit for a long lineage of printmakers. She has a distinct role in the history of printmaking. Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez trained Sister Carita Kent in the technological skills of serigraphy in the Martínez family garage in Hollywood. There, around 1951, Carita learned from her the serigraphy skills that Maria had mastered in reproducing her husband's images. In the year 2011, the Norton Simon Museum mounted an exhibition and catalog titled Proof, The Rise of Printmaking in Southern California. In this book, Jennifer Anderson conveys that Carita Kent obtained a screen printing kit to use with her own students. Everything was going fine until she realized she did not have the proper solvent to remove the photo stencil from the screen. A student watching her suggested that she meet Maria de Sode Romero Martínez, the widow of the Mexican muralist Alfredo Martínez, whom Kent credits with teaching her the step-by-step process of screen printing. Despite this fact, Mrs. Martínez is not honored with any further background identity or visual evidence of work in the survey. Sister Carita Kent was a member of the Order of the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart, who lived and taught art locally at Immaculate Heart College. Sister Carita used the vivid colors of the serigraph process to enliven her liturgical subjects. When she won first place in the prestigious Los Angeles County Museum of Art's print competition in 1952, Sister Carita brought serigraphy into the limelight. Kent's expressionistic Baroque Madonnas soon gave way in the 1960s to more abstract celebrations of pop cultural plenitude. She was featured on the cover of Newsweek magazine and designed a U.S. postage stamp. Carita Kent has enjoyed historical re-exposure lately, as her vision of 1960s culture is decidedly postmodern, with its simultaneous embrace of high and low culture. Coincidentally, in exactly 1 year, the Pasadena Museum of California Art will host an exhibition of Carita Kent's work in the space where Ramos Martínez is exhibited now. Our next step is Sister Karen Bocalero, a Franciscan nun who walked into Sister Carita's classroom at Immaculate Heart College and embraced the process of silkscreen printing with enthusiasm. Karen Bocalero acted on her commitment to nurture human potential and opened a communal art studio in East Los Angeles in 1971, the earliest site of Self-Help Graphics Center. In that space, which was actually another converted garage, serigraphy workshops and equipment became an attraction for a growing number of Chicano artists. Some posed there in front of their movable feast of art, the Barrio Mobile Art Studio. So we have Maria Sode de Ramos Martínez mentoring Carita Kent, who mentored Sister Karen Bocalero, who mentored many artists of the Self-Help Graphics Co-op. Here on the right, a 12-color silkscreen print by one Self-Help Graphics Co-op member, Tony Ortega. Frida and Diego show us around Mexico from 1991, a playful treatment of Mexicanidad with the couple in their LL Bean fleece. Self-Help Graphics Co-op artist Alfredo de Batuc's 7 Views of City Hall from 1987 on the right makes a visual pun of the Virgin of Guadalupe motif, treated so sincerely in the Ramos Martínez Veneration painting, printed as a serigraph by Maria Martínez, the image on the left. The work of contemporary artists demonstrates a playful appropriation of the same Mexican national motifs that Ramos Martínez and other post-revolutionary artists embraced with sincerity. A third example, Louis Perez of Self-Help Graphics, gives us a 1989 12-color silkscreen called Thinking of Jesus and Mary. The implied newspaper support, you read Times classified ads there, might be deliberate homage to the processes of Ramos and Maria Martínez. With the screen printing facilities at Self-Help Graphics, Chicano artists in LA gained significant reputations regionally as well as internationally. I find it of value to be able to trace the introduction of the technique of serigraphy in Los Angeles through a lineage that goes back through Carita Kent to Maria Sode de Ramos Martínez. Her work is so respectful of her husband's post-revolutionary Mexican motifs. Scholar Margarita Nieto described Ramos Martínez as a cultural conduit between 2 continents and 3 countries. His wife is a cultural conduit as well. If you saw the Ramos Martínez exhibition in Pasadena, you know that the museum contains a second show, Serigrafía, silkscreens from California's Latino printmaking community. Serigrafía contains some examples of self-help graphics work. It surveys this tradition of design, featuring 30 influential silkscreens from the 1970s to the present, such as Javier Viramonte's powerful 1973 serigraph in support of the United Farm Workers Union, Boycott Grapes. Including self-help graphics co-op, by 1972 there were 7 major Chicano collectives throughout California producing silkscreen posters. Serigrafía's survey explores this tradition. This is the very tradition made possible through the skills and drive of Maria Martínez. At the Pasadena Museum of California Art, I was excited to see the silkscreen posters by the younger members of the Chicano collectives just a room away from a silkscreen print by their abuela, Maria Martínez. I'll leave you with one final thought. In Mexico, there is a class distinction between arte culto, fine art, and arte popular, popular art, or more accurately translated as art of the people. Muralism, introduced by post-revolutionary artists, including Martínez, is the most widely known of the Mexican arts for the people. But graphic arts are a second form of public art with deep national appeal. I propose that Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez was involved in transforming her husband's unique, one-of-a-kind painted images into arte popular, art of the people. In a process that Ramos Martínez would surely approve of, she multiplied the forms, democratizing the Martínez images, an ethos continued by self-help graphics co-op. Through the process of serigraphy, she produced multiples, making them available for enjoyment of the masses, not just the wealthy elite of Hollywood who could afford a Ramos Martínez mural or oil painting. The role of Maria Martínez in relation to Los Angeles printmaking is one that deserves to be teased out. The museums and publishing houses need to correct their records. She, not her husband, produced 7 serigraphic print editions. Her hand and heart played parts in the cultural hybrid lineage of America's blended traditions. Maria Sodi de Ramos Martínez is a pivotal figure in Los Angeles printmaking because she was a link in the chain of personalities that connects early 20th century Mexican modernism to contemporary Chicano art. Thank you.
We did have 3 campaigns, conservation campaigns starting, as Mary mentioned, 1995. That went into 1996 and was preceded by the theoretical studies by Jerry Padani and Ed Sanchez, which were also augmented by chemical analysis by John Twilley, who at that time worked at Los Angeles County Art Museum, and who was the one who identified all the pigments and tried very hard to identify the medium of this particular fresco. And it, unfortunately, like many other true frescoes made by American painters who had studied in Europe and came back to the United States and specifically to Los Angeles, feeling hopeful that they will be able to create same true fresco that they learned about in Europe, rarely was it possible. And I have worked on many true frescoes, so-called true frescoes by many American artists, which turn out in the end to be fresco secco, which means trying to work on wet plaster and having the giornate, which are the sections that the artist is able to do as in everyday's work. So you then have lines in plaster that identify your day's work, and then you move on to the next one, adjacent, hopefully, section. And many of the murals were started in buon fresco and were then finished in fresco secco, which meant that paint was added, paint of various media was added onto the fresco itself. And so there are many different problems of adhesion that followed throughout the years. And the Ramos Martínez mural was complex in that he did use buon fresco technique, and 3.5 of the 9 panels were finished on the intonaco layer, which is the uppermost fine layer of plaster. And so he did have an assistant who applied the plaster, and he applied the paint onto the wet plaster, and then it dried and solidified. It becomes hardens chemically. However, because of the fact that I believe that he knew he didn't have enough time to do all 9 panels to the same degree of finish that he did the 3 panels which he completed. And so several of the 9 panels were painted completely in full color on the brown coat, which is the arricchio, which is the layer that's underneath the intonaco in the traditional buon fresco technique. And of course, we know that at least 3.5 were left in the unfinished condition. That means they were sketches in sepia, in red ochre color, and also on the arricchio layer. So they never made it to the finished fine plaster layer of intonaco. This mural presents a unique opportunity to study his technique, of course, for that reason.
Projector must have shut off.
That's it, just one button. And
Yeah,
okay,
it should come back on in about a minute and a half.
okay, that's great, thank you. So just to get started, because I know we're behind schedule, we know that the artist started at both ends of the garden. He started with panel A, which is the one on the far east, and then panel I on the far west end of the garden, and one is of an armadillo in vegetation, and the other one of 2 coyote-type animals. So you see the 1996 after treatment condition. This is last week, so it does look a little bit dirty, and I just wanted to have a look at it before I came to speak. And this is our initial photograph of the mural before treatment in 1995. So many condition issues were encountered. We have the artist with some important individuals. I don't know who they are, but they're posing in front of the mural. And the artist at work on panels H and panel C. And again, the titling of the panels, we just followed what Jerry Padani decided to do and name them going from left to right, which is kind of a traditional way of naming it. But since we know that he worked his way in from the outside, and his assistant, Sheldon Horton, insists that when he came to help him, he was at work on the panel which was at the very far right end, which is the 2 coyote. And that was the first panel that he did. So it's possible that we should have numbered them starting at the right and going to the left, but it doesn't ultimately matter. Artist looking at his work and or perhaps painting. It seems that he dressed up every day to go and paint, which is really hard to believe. Conservators never do that. Okay, here we have the chronology which I was explaining to you before. So we have panel A and panel I, which I believe were painted at the same time, perhaps, we certainly know he started here, and then these 3 panels were finished on the final intonical layer. This and this portrait he left for last, and continued, I'm not sure in what order, to work on the remaining panels. And this one is very unique in that half of it, the top half at the right side, is finished on the intonical, and then we have this break, or rather the edge of the intonical layer plaster, and then underneath all we see is the arricchio with the first sketch. As Mary mentioned, the Getty did an incredible amount of, put an incredible amount of work and did a very detailed documentation, which was fantastically helpful to us. We love to come in and have some information already in place so that we can get on with the hands-on treatment. We see the detail of the panel after treatment of the first one of the armadillo. And as Mary mentioned, each panel was documented, so you see the graffiti that we found on panel C, or rather underneath it, and various conditions that were present that we now can relate back to. We have continued our ongoing documentation. We have actually come back in 2002 for some small graffiti problem, I think. And so we have documentation from then as well as from 2006. So if we were to come back again, we will be able to look at all these layers of documentation and compare the changes that occurred since. I'm showing you a raking light image on the right, just to give you an idea of what the arricchio looked like. It was really roughly applied, and it was never meant to be seen in the finished state. The reason the plaster was applied roughly was so that it could grab the final layer of plaster more easily. And so, even though this is one of the most beautiful images that I have ever seen, and I love that he didn't finish it, and I don't mean it in any malicious way, but it's rare that you see that kind of progress of work, of unfinished fresco. Here, we think that he may have painted out a basket of flowers that perhaps he didn't think fitted the composition, and so you can see outlines of the basket. Again, this is the panel which baffled me from the beginning, because the top right of it is completely finished and the bottom left is just the sketch. And I'm not sure if he was maybe doing perhaps he was teaching someone, maybe he was doing a lesson and he wanted to show the students how it's done and what levels are there from beginning to end. And unfortunately then he got ill and never finished it. But it's wonderful to see his work in progress. And here are some details of our work in 1995-96. Again, a close-up of that panel that was unfinished. And some flaking of paint in very critical parts of design, such as the face on panel F, as well as vandalism. Unfortunately, the centers of the eyes were gouged out with a sharp object, and it was quite difficult to figure out which little bits were missing paint and gouged out bits, and which ones to leave as part of the composition, because some of it were the highlights of the pupil. So we did take great care in identifying areas that needed to be addressed and those that needed to be left alone because it was part of the process. Water damage was quite a problem, and in this panel we had a very difficult task of reintegrating that wide section that you see on the left-hand side of completely bleached paint. I mean, this is all dirty, but this is bleached by water. And so we carefully cleaned the areas around the loss, which was, by the way, very powdery, so it was hard to even touch with even a brush, and then reintegrated the two so that they could be, and I have a photo of it later to show you later. The vegetation and the roots of some vines were very invasive, especially on the two end panels. And at some point, I felt like I needed a degree in gardening as well as conservation to figure out how to take those little suckers off the surface without destroying the paint. We were successful to some degree, and unfortunately, some of it we had to in-paint. Here, we're vacuuming off the salts, and you can see the little tiny root systems and all the losses due to salt efflorescence. So overall, the panel was really quite damaged. What you see up here behind these white sections of, it's cotton poultice with a chemical that helps to absorb the salt so that they don't return. More salt efflorescence and details, a close-up of a poultice, and then the very far right panel with the wild dogs. We also filled some holes that were in between the panels, and we made sure that we textured each fill, and we used a very similar grain of the material that we used so that it would be a seamless transition, even though you always want to be able to see the conservator's work versus the original art. But that's where the documentation is very helpful. Some before and afters, and more water damage and abrasion due to salts, and very dirty surface. Here you see a detail of the top left corner where the palm fronds were quite dirty and damaged, and we were able to repair them quite successfully. The graffiti was very carefully toned, and cracks were filled so that the apron that's below, that runs along the entire wall, was again clean. And it's very important, we found over the years, to remove graffiti or obliterate graffiti, because it begets new graffiti if you leave it in place. And so we did take extra time to make sure that that was no longer visible. This is our team again in 2006 doing another surface cleaning and making sure everything is in good order. And some of the Scripps flowers. And then one after and one before treatment, and 7 more to go. When Mary asked me a few weeks ago to be part of this symposium, I was really thrilled. And then she also mentioned the Siqueiros mural that we recently finished, actually last year, and she said, would you be able to say a few words about that project? And I said, yes, I would be happy to. I'm not sure how the two relate, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that not only was Siqueiros a student of Ramos Martínez, even though that's probably brief and wasn't really that critical in his development as an artist. However, Siqueiros did retain certain basic tradition of following a tradition of fresco painting that was fairly typical for American artists in that time. And here I just show you a compilation the Getty did for America Tropical over the years and the changes that it had undergone. It was a very long and painful process of trying to figure out what to do, who should pay for what, and how it should be protected once it's finally opened again, open to the public. And so the Getty Conservation Institute, of course, was in charge. And again, I was lucky to piggyback on their research. And I got to come in for the last phase of cleaning and reintegration. And we were very cautious about reintegration, which means in-painting of losses, because there was so little left, or so we thought. And then the more we dealt with the surface and the more we cleaned and looked at it and sat really close to it, the more we realized that actually with the composites of black and white photographs that we had, historic photographs of the mural before it was whitewashed, we were able to see a lot more detail than originally thought. So here is our first very cautious attempt at reintegration. And this is one of the upper left tree trunks. This is before and this is after. And then when we completed this and one other section, we invited the GCI personnel to come and give us their blessing to carry on. And then we also were able to, okay, so here's what I wanted to say about Martínez and Siqueiros and the similarities between the two murals. Martínez was never able to finish because of his untimely death, and so he left several sections in an unfinished stage. In the case of Siqueiros, with the controversy and the very different materials that he used instead of the traditional fresco materials, very experimental materials and techniques, his paint actually did not stand the test of time. And so what we inevitably ended up with is having, this is the black and white composite, and this is the current state of the crucified figure, and you can see that in many areas, all you see is the underpainting in red ochre, with the uppermost layer of highlights completely gone, because it fell off either due to exposure to weather conditions and or the whitewash that the painting was covered with. So ironically, we end up with a very similar condition situation in the Siqueiros, in that time reveals for us the underpainting of the fresco. And so again, we're unable to correct that because we cannot paint a layer that's gone missing. And so in many situations, again, on the left you see the black and white composite and the current appearance of the mural. We tried very hard to barely suggest where the limbs start and end, and were unable to bring back the beautiful three-dimensionality of the colors because there just wasn't enough paint. I think that treatment was fantastically successful. I believe that we started out thinking that we'll be able to do very little, but we're actually able to do quite a bit more than we thought, in another comparison. And then while in treatment, we found an app. Amazingly enough, there is an iPad app that's an iPad Touch, which allows you to photograph a section of the mural and then photograph a section of the black and white composite and superimpose the two. And with very tedious and very long sessions of looking at the arm of a crucified figure as we found it, and the black and white composite of the arm as we knew it looked, how it looked, we were able to, by superimposition, bring a little bit more detail, because we actually found bits of paint where they were supposed to be. We would have not ever been able to identify that these 17 dots of brown color created a rope if we didn't have something to go by that we were able to graphically superimpose over one another. Here's the top right corner of the sharpshooters, and you can see the image that we were presented with at the time of treatment. And then with this superimposed image of the black and white photograph, we put tiny little dots of black tape of the critical points of intersection, and were able to then reconnect between this image, and this is the same face and color currently existing, and the other sharpshooter with the profile here, and do this, which is, I think, a lot. And from the beginning, the controversy about America Tropical was that how tropical is it? There's no vegetation. Well, little did we know, there were traces of leaves everywhere, and we were able to bring them out, even though it was just tones of gray and tones of very pale green, but we were able to recover them. And in situations like the top left, which was much more damaged than the right side, because the right side was whitewashed immediately after it was painted to obliterate it from the view from the street, you can see these dark bits of paint. That's all there was left, and everything else is just a shadow of its own self. Again, you have a situation where there's a column and all the red is underpainting, and these residual white lines is what the column would have looked like had it not lost its paint. So of course we weren't able to bring the white all the way down, but we at least have a suggestion of it. Chacmo before and after a treatment, the eagle above the crucified figure. We went through the same process of superimposing images too, and a very happy team at the end of the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annetta. I think I'd like to invite our panelists up to the table, and while they're getting settled and turning on their mics, I'll just let you know a bit about our wonderful moderator, Suzanne Muchnick, who has many connections to Scripps. As I mentioned before, she's an alumna and trustee of the college. She also won the Distinguished Alumna Award at Scripps College and Claremont Graduate University. For many years, she was an art writer for the Los Angeles Times, where she covered art from all over the world. Now she continues to write for many art magazines and newspapers as well. Her specialty is the art of Los Angeles, and she knows that well. She's covered that beat for a long time. She's also written books that give us a broader view of that history and an in-depth look. The first, Odd Man In, Norton Simon and the Pursuit of Culture, was an unforgettable biography of a man who created an extraordinary museum that we still know as one of the finest of its kind in the country. And she also wrote, is writing, soon to come out, the biography of painter Helen Lundeberg, who is also a leading artist in Los Angeles and one who we need to know more about. She's now writing a history of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and that will cover, it will span its beginnings from a modest organization with many identities to its current major presence on the art scene internationally. So I'm now pleased to turn the program over to Suzanne and the panelists.
Thanks to all of you for being here. I was introduced to Alfredo Ramos Martínez as a student here at Scripps College, as were many, many other students. And in my version of the good old days at Scripps College, it was, as it remains, just a wonderful, wonderful place to go for all kinds of things. I remember going there for art classes and for social occasions, and as just a special quiet retreat. And it still, I think, is my favorite place on campus. At the time, of course, I knew nothing about the artist, having moved here from the Midwest. It was not part of my history. But in my long career at the LA Times, I did, of course, come across his work in various different ways, occasionally in a private collection or perhaps a mural that I would, discover on my route, and very occasionally got a chance to write about him. I do recall when Annetta was doing her good work here at Scripps and coming out to see the mural and writing about it for the LA Times. I think that the first exhibition of his work I ever saw was at Louis Stern's gallery when it was in Beverly Hills in 1991-92. And of course, there was a Scripps event at the gallery, and we all, gathered round and met Maria at that time. So, my bit of knowledge about the artist has been growing a lot. I have to say today, I learned a great deal from all of you. It was really a fantastic breadth of information and depth in areas that I hadn't known about at all. But one thing I thought we might address, we'll talk among ourselves here for a few minutes, and then I hope some of you will have questions, and we'll open that up to the audience before we go have our tea. I was especially interested in the artist's reputation and how he's regarded, his place in history, and to what degree that may have changed over the past few years. As I've learned more about him, I think perhaps other people have as well, and he's had more exposure. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that. If you have a sense of whether he is still so completely overshadowed by the big three, as we know, the artists who were much more political and perhaps more vigorous in their aesthetic approach, or whether, just how he fits into the great scheme of things. So, Amy, do you have, or you want to start? Let's start. Mary?
I want to address this from the position of someone who teaches art history and has done that for a few decades. It used to be that histories of art were specifically national, that the textbooks were limited to what was deemed American art history versus Mexican art history, and never the two did meet. And so I think the benefit of the time that we live in now is that the global perspective reigns, and that an artist like Alfredo Ramos Martínez is now integral to the way histories of art are being written and published, to take a global perspective and see movement throughout.
Great. Amy?
Well, I think that's such a great question, and I actually, in preparation for my talk, I wanted to look at all my survey of Latin American art books to see where he is, and I didn't, so I think from memory, there are often 3 books, the surveys of modern Latin American art that are cited, one by Don Ades, The Art of Latin America, one by Edward Sullivan, which looks at sort of each country, modern developments in each country, and then one by Jacqueline Burnett's Modern Art of Latin America. And, they've all come out in the last, 10, 15 years, and they're often used as the texts in classes on modern art in Latin America. And I think it's only Jacqueline Burnett's book that mentions Ramos Martínez and includes an image. But one of the things that I've been really excited about is I do think there is an increased interest in Ramos Martínez. I have met a colleague in Minneapolis who is, the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts has a work by Ramos Martínez, and he's doing research as a result of kind of uncovering this work in their vaults. I think there's been an increased interest in the open-air schools. Ramos Martínez was so essential to founding in Mexico. The Phoenix Art Museum a couple of years ago did an exhibition of the collection of Andres Blaiston, a great collector of modern art in Mexico, and he also has a Ramos Martínez in his collection. And in coinciding with that show, they did an exhibition from their collection of works created in the open-air school. And I think it's Munal, maybe Louis knows, I think is working on an open-air school, the Museum of National Art in Mexico City, working on an open-air school exhibition. So I think, as this period of, Mexican modernism, American modernism, looking for more stories, looking for more diverse stories, looking for more stories that reflect that in-between space that I talked about, I think there has been an increased interest in his work.
Great. Annetta, have you noticed from conservators, is there an increased knowledge of his work, or is he still someone who's perhaps relatively little known?
I think that we are so focused on the technical aspects of any mural that we work on that I wouldn't say that there's been a renewed interest. My personal interest is renewed each time I come to campus, and of course the internet reaches everyone, including my children, who are now happy to look at Martínez mural imagery because I'm working on it, and they were happy to see the graffiti, and then the graffiti was gone, and they thought, oh, Mom, you're doing such a great job. So I think there's renewed interest in the younger generation, but my colleagues, I think, covered it really well. Thank you.
Great. Just as a follow-up to that, I wonder if I was curious to know how if his reputation, at least as I perceive it in a very broad, general way, of how he's regarded in the United States, would that be similar in Mexico? Do you think there's a difference in perception of his importance there from here? Is he better known there?
I think he's better known in Mexico than he's known here. I think also the work is different too. I think there is a change from the work from Mexico to the United States, you know, with that more sort of what I call the sepia tone colors that of the work in the U.S., the more focus on the sort of line and geometric form, the reduction of detail, much more so than his work created in Mexico. I think, you know, it's one of the great things, I think, is there's the Ramos Martínez as he's known in Mexico, and then the Ramos Martínez as he's known here. Recently, about a year ago, someone called me at the San Diego Museum of Art and said, oh, I have a Ramos Martínez, will you come and look at it? And it was from 1910, and it was a portrait of a woman. And my colleagues, the curators of European art and the curators of Asian art at the museum, could not believe what I came back and showed them an image of was by Ramos Martínez, because they only knew the Ramos Martínez works in the collection of the San Diego Museum of Art, which is the California work and is so distinctive from a lot of the work done in Mexico. So I think he's more known in Mexico. I think that, but there's a lot more that can be shared about the different types of work created in both countries.
Interesting. Well, that makes me think of another question I had in mind, and that this one pertains, or at least it grows from the exhibition that is currently on in Pasadena. If any of you have not seen that yet, you have a few more weeks, and it's terrific. You really must see it. But one thing that I heard in the way of comments from friends and acquaintances were they kind of drew in their breath when they saw this one room of works on paper, which tended to be relatively quiet and very delicate and that kind of gentle, not completely, there were some tough images too, but the relatively gentle, pastoral almost side of him that we see. And then they would come to those tremendously powerful monumental heads and just couldn't believe, is this the same artist? Well, of course it is. But you spoke quite a bit about this, about the breadth of his work, and you've just gotten into that again. But I wonder if you see kind of two sides to this artist, or is it just part of a continuum?
For me, I think it's a continuum. When I see, for example, the Scripps mural, when I see it in its totality, or I see the La Avenida Cafe, those parts of it that remain in the different locations that they are, I see the flower vendors, the focus on women, the interest in indigenous women wearing, traditional skirts or traditional braided hair. I mean, I see those relationships in the newspaper work. I think what fascinates a lot of art historians about the newspaper work is the content, which Mary touched on in her presentation. That these images of laborers, of women with, offering flowers, carrying flowers on the top of their head, they might be seen as just tranquil images if you put them in concert with the classifieds of the LA Times, beauty ads, or the business pages, and the economics. And and thinking about what was happening at the time, whether it be the Depression or leading into World War I, or the policy of repatriation, Mexican laborers being sent back to Mexico. I think, there's a lot of content there, and I think, for me, I do see a connection between both formally and subject-wise, I guess, with the earlier work and those big monumental forms.
I'd like to chime in this regard in a way that pulls together both your recent questions. I was fortunate enough to see the show in the early 90s in Monterrey, Mexico, where the city of Monterrey claimed Ramos Martínez as their son, since that was the city of his birth. And it was a huge show, multiple floors of the museums with hundreds of works, none of which were done in California. And so my feeling is that Ramos Martínez doesn't just have two sides, but 7 or 8 or 9, because of his responding to commissions for the portraits of women that were the mode in Mexico in the teens, as well as his works that touched on post-revolutionary activities, just so many sides of him.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I suppose one could say that of most artists. Once you get into really digging into the history of them, you find that you might have some kind of little postcard sort of image in your mind, but there's a whole lot going on there. Annette, I wonder, and you're working on this mural, just sitting here even, did you ever get the sense that this was done by more than one artist? I mean, if you follow me, I mean, here we see one of these very, large, intense heads. It's so beautiful, and yet they're very different aspects that come to light. You can see a lot of different strains of his work, I think, in the various panels.
I think that he definitely had at least two sides to him, and I agree with my colleagues, and I think there's something to be said for scale. When he worked in an intimate scale of making a portrait of a person, and it was a commission, that would be a very different approach than making a statement in form of a giant head of a woman carrying a basket with flowers. And I think that alone makes a much different impact on the viewer. And yes, you're right, it does appear that because we have so many different levels of completion in this particular mural remain on view until today, it seems like many different hands painted the panels. However, I think that his working process is revealed in this mural, starting from a small sketch, and which I'm sure he did, and we know that he did many small sketches in preparation for murals. It wasn't unlike John Singer Sargent, who was commissioned thousands of portraits, and when he worked for the Boston Public Library and commissioned to do those murals, they were monumental scale figures, and again, one person, but depending on scale, I think it looks very different.
Yeah. Great. Well, I am going to ask for questions shortly from the audience, but I'm going to sort of turn the tables here for a minute, and there's someone in the audience of whom I'd like to ask a question, and that is Louis Stern, who's been referred to a few times here. And the reason for this question is that I think, part of, unfortunately, I suppose, how we regard artists is often how they are regarded in the marketplace. And over the past few years, it's been quite stunning to me to watch some staggering prices being paid for his work at auction, which is very exciting because, it certainly does indicate a growing interest and belief in the value of this artist. But Louis, you followed this and have sold a lot of his works. I wonder if you have some sense of how and why the market has grown so greatly and really kind of spectacularly in recent years.
I think the artist was forgotten,
Uh-huh.
especially since it's been a long time since his association with the Hatfield Galleries. And I sort of stumbled upon Ramos Martínez by accident. I just looked at the work and I was very impressed with it. In fact, I thought it was by Diego Rivera, what I had seen. Then I was informed it was by Ramos Martínez, and frankly, at the time, I didn't know who the artist was.
And when was that roughly? Do you remember?
Wow. Probably about 30, 35 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And then I realized that here was a wonderful artist who had been neglected, as so many other artists have been. And I sort of made it my mission to bring him back. And I started acquiring his work, and in 1991, we did the first exhibition in the gallery in Beverly Hills, and it was very well received. It was timed to coincide with the Splendors in Mexico show, which opened at Blackman at the same time.
Oh, that's right.
And it was at that moment that I was approached by the director of the Munal, who later that year did the retrospective in Mexico. And then, as Mary mentions, a few years later, in conjunction with 400th anniversary of the city of Monterey, the museum in Marco, which is the Contemporary Museum, did the show for him there along with a photographic exhibition. But I think as people started noticing the work, and especially major works came out, the large compositions of the flower vendors or the fruit vendors became very, very popular. And people start realizing the importance of Ramos Martínez juxtaposed to the three great artists, and started realizing that here was somebody that was really forgotten and never got the recognition for the open air school, and he's really considered today to be the father of Mexican modernism.
Great, thank you. Just perhaps a follow-up to that, and some of you may know this too, but I'm curious to what degree his work is finding a place in museum collections. Are you?
So, well, I think what's interesting, of course, in part sort of related to your question about is he becoming better known, is that I think the works are here, they're localized. You know, I think they're localized to California collections, and I think, you know, hopefully exhibitions like the one in Pasadena, in Mary's research that she's publishing, will bring greater attention. But, you know, there's a work in Dallas, there's a work in Minneapolis, you know, there's works in Phoenix, but for the most part, the museum work is here in California, and, you know, wouldn't it be great to see it in other places, you know, in Kansas City, you know, in Boston, and other museums, and not just one, you know, have a lot of different works. You know, I'm lucky to have been at the San Diego Museum of Art for 4 years, and because Ramos Martínez worked there are so many private collections that have works by Ramos Martínez, and so many people have great stories of their families going to La Avenida Cafe, and, you know, I think that will continue, that there will be, you know, museums like the San Diego Museum of Art, hopefully also here at Scripps, Santa Barbara, where Ramos Martínez was, you'll see these centers of, you know, having institutions with many work. I was really happy, though, recently, you know, LACMA reinstalled their galleries, and they had their big Ramos Martínez out, which was nice. I think that was maybe 7-8 months ago, so,
Good.
yeah.
That's great. Well, Annetta, one for you. No hiding there. I was fascinated by, you know, I can't imagine doing the kind of work you do, but And I can appreciate that there were some benefits in working on a mural that was unfinished, but I'm sure some challenges as well. And it made me wonder if you had a good sense of how this mural would look if it were finished. Were there drawings and that really indicated where he was going, or could you simply tell from the work that was done?
The one panel that is half completely finished and half in the prep state of just the red drawing is probably on the indication of what it would look like if they were all finished. I know that Mary could probably speak better to it and tell us what pieces are in the possession of Scripps that were prep drawings.
We actually have no drawings for the mural.
Oh, really?
We have no drawings in our collection, no.
Wow.
So, this, I'm just, if the drawings exist, perhaps, Maria Martínez-Bolster might know where they might be, but nothing was left to Scripps in art archives, and I'm just astounded by what he did in the time he had. We're not sure exactly how long he worked on this, but say he began in early 1946, if he had 6, maybe 7 months, what he accomplished was extraordinary. And you would think an artist today working on a mural this size would project an image and then draw it, but he clearly drew it just from working directly on the panel. Because we find no marks for enlarging work. So I'm curious, and that I mentioned how Siqueiros worked with experimental materials, and he's known for that. And yet he studied with Ramos Martínez. Did Ramos Martínez use a very traditional method of fresco painting? You mentioned that there was some fresco secos from the painting after it had dried. Was that a traditional method, or was that something that he did differently?
Well, the traditional Italian fresco, buon fresco, is very different from what we see in Southern California. But most of the artists who went to Europe to study and came back used a variation of what they learned, because buon fresco is extremely difficult and takes a long time to learn how to, and not only by the artist, but by skilled assistants who can apply the plaster, mix the plaster so that it stays wet long enough for the paint to be absorbed and then dries, and then it looks beautiful the next day. And it didn't necessarily happen for every artist who tried it on this continent. And so many of them came back the next day and the week after and added paint because it was too pale or it was too soft, or perhaps they needed more of an outline. And so you see a lot of fresco secco. Even the Italians, I'm sure we have experts here on Italian Renaissance, they didn't all paint in buon fresco. There were many instances where artists came back and didn't necessarily chip away the day's work, but finished it in secco technique. So he was as traditional as any artist on this soil would be, and Siqueiros wasn't, but that's very different.
This is nothing like the Last Supper in Milan with Queen Maria. What she took on for 15 years, there should be a big statue of her out in front of Santa Fe delle Grazie, because there is experiment galore in animal fat and everything else, secco.
Right.
Yeah, and I think if I could just say,
Please,
it's really, it comes for me full circle, because in 1966, of course, was the Great Flood in Florence, and as a result, they had to strappatto many of these frescoes, and they discovered all these Sinopia paintings, and they really sort of began a study of the techniques of mural painting. And I mentioned to Anita before, E. Borso's work in the 1970s on fresco painting. She's famous along with Tintori and the great restorers, So 1966, and the Great Age of Fresco show at the Met, 1969, 1970, which was a very important moment. I was an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins, and a class of mine, John White was teaching at Hopkins. We went to New York and saw that. I saw it in 1969, 70, and there it was, you know, and this was just the year before I made my first trip to Florence to see these frescoes and to see Florence. And you know, the studies on fresco painting in the late 60s and the 70s as a result of that tragedy was really monumental, so important. And this, to me, when I came to Pomona in 1980, to see frescoes like this, that were unfinished, that I could really, with the students, go through on fresco technique here in California, was really astounding. Just an inspiration, entirely an inspiration.
I think it remains one for almost anyone who sees that. We have a few more minutes. Is there anyone in the audience who has a question of any of the panelists? Don't be shy. There we go.
What was the controversy with the open air school? It indicated at the show that there was some controversy over the open air school. Is that not?
So the open air school, and Mary, you could jump in if you like, but you know, initially it was, you know, this. I mean, it wasn't initially. It was this great project of, you know, teaching art, making art accessible. One of the great legacies of the open air school is that the supplies were free. You know, students could get canvases, students could get paints. I mentioned that private collection earlier, Andres Bleiston, and he has a great collection of students of the open air school, and you know, for some of them that was their only training, you know, and they became amazing artists, you know, through this process and having access to art education. And very many significant modernists working in Mexico, like Rufino Tamayo, Fernando Leal, Jean Charlot, who I spoke about in my presentation, Adolfo Besmagard, taught at the open air school. But, you know, Rivera in the end, you know, was very critical of it and saying that it had evolved into, you know, pretty late, you know, well-off women were like going to learn how to paint, and that, you know, it had moved away from any sort of, you know, in Rivera's perception, this kind of revolutionary, you know, thing.
And one thing that I think might be referred to as controversial with the open air school is that art education in Mexico until 1910 or 11 was still being taught as a European methodology. Students learned how to make art by tracing plaster casts of Greek and Roman statues. Which now to us sounds very antique and antiquated, but it was that sort of academic approach to art making that structured art education in Mexico even up to 1910. So the open air schools in which students drew from life, they drew from the marketplace, they drew people working and weaving as training, was a revolutionary approach to art education.
Thank you. Yes.
This might be off topic, and I apologize ahead of time, but I have two questions, and they're both about the Siqueiros mural that was restored recently. One is, where is it? Besides Olvera Street, I know that. Two is, you referred to it having been whitewashed, and I'm kind of curious about that. I know that during certain eras there were political ramifications of works, but I really don't know. I'm not in the art world, and I don't really know about that, but I'm curious.
Okay, well, it is, you know, you're not alone in wondering where it is. And I worked downtown for a zillion years, and I used to think, and I certainly knew where Olvera Street was. Where is that mural? And finally, I did find out it's only a bit of it is actually visible, you know, from the street, the market street. And it's on the second floor It is an outdoor mural, of course. That's why it's had so much difficulty, but it's on the second floor. It used to be the, well, I guess it still is the Italian Hall that has, I think, is maybe reopened as something else. And there are different accounts of how that was used, but apparently there was a rooftop garden or cafe or beer parlor or something that was out on that, and then along, you know, this one wall was the mural. And in fact, the subject matter was very controversial, and the central figure, which Annetta showed you, the crucifix, you know, like figure, Siqueiros painted that as the story goes at the very last moment, so that no one would see it and get upset and tell him to, you know, redo it. And when it was seen, you know, by the public or the officials and the people who had hoped this would be a very peaceful, lovely, calm, decorative kind of mural, got a big surprise. A portion of it was whitewashed right away, as I understand it, but it was just a kind of a corner of it, and that was a corner that could be seen from the lower area. That, I think, turned out to be a blessing for conservators, because that part ended up being better protected, you know, from the elements. But then I forgot now the passage of time. A few years later, the whole thing was whitewashed. Is that roughly true?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The first.
Was the controversy, did it have to do with public money and religion, or did it have to do with?
Oh, well, there was this Mexican figure who was crucified. He was a peasant, and above it was an American eagle. And then over to one side were these sharpshooters who were firing at the eagle, I guess.
Yes.
So it was seen as very, very anti-American.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't go into detail. There wasn't time, and but it's fantastic to go and have a look if you are so inclined. The Interpretive Center, which was designed and built by the Getty Conservation Institute, which is where you walk through to get to the second floor of Italian Hall to actually see the mural from the platform. You have to go through the Interpretive Center, and you can lose yourself there for hours with fantastic stories and all of history from...
Is it a place that's easy to find, or should I Google it, or what?
Yes, you can Google America Tropical, and it will be there.
You will find. I mean, you know, Olvera Street is very short, and so you can't go too far astray. The entrance it's sort of almost in the center of it. But I too would encourage you to go. I think the people who are expecting a brightly colored, highly defined image are disappointed, of course, that there was no way that could be done without just recreating it, and no respectable conservator, of course, would do that these days. So it is, as is often said, a sort of a ghost of its former self, or a shadow of its former self. But the work that was done is incredible, and really, if you just slow down and look for a while, you can see, you know, you really can get a good idea of what was there. And they have those people who took great pains to install the interpretive center and the viewing platform. You have to look at it from a distance, but there is a black and white, very graphic image of what it looked like. No color photograph of it exists. You know, there simply was you know, black and white photography, but that's there, so you can refer to that, you know, as you look at a distance at the larger image. And it's, you know, it's free. It's a wonderful thing that's available to us all. So I think we probably need to go to tea. Or time for okay. Okay.
I just want to say that the mural, the fresco of Ramos Martínez are an endangered species. Some of them aren't here anymore, and it's up to people that care for them, you know, to really help to conserve them for the future.
Thank you so much. I think we're off.